Hello there and welcome to the video, where today I'm going to be attempting to reignite my passion for Souls games by returning to my favorite Souls game of all time, Elden Ring. Now, please note that I'm not wearing my glasses today and can't see very well at all, so might not be playing the greatest quality gameplay, but it is what it is. Anyway, let's get started. So let's load up a new game and begin the intro cinematic, which obviously is incredibly detailed. This really sets the tone for the game, both in its atmosphere and the overall polished quality feel that the game will have. I mean, clearly they're not gonna have a super nice looking cutscene and then the game looks like shit, right? That'd be crazy. Okay, so we start out as this green monstrosity before entering this cutscene and getting a chance to create our character by first choosing an awesome name, then choosing the only class that's actually viable because of its high adaptability stat, and choosing the bonfire aesthetic as our gift so we can pull some fun shenanigans later. And now that we have our build, we can progress to the first real challenging fight of the game, the noob killer boss, in this instance being a fat hippo monster that falls on its ass repeatedly. But at least it doesn't drop a powerful item, right? Oh, it drops a stone ring, one of the most powerful rings in the entire game. And that's largely due to the fact that this game is infamous for having tons of enemies thrown at you at any given time. This ring gives you plus 30 poise damage, which means you can much more easily stun lock enemies and deal with the crowds more effectively. Now with our new ring equipped, we can find our way to the round table hold and meet up with Melina, who will give us the ability to turn our runes into strength. And this is where we'll begin to develop our build. And one of the interesting things that Elden Ring did that no other game did before it is to introduce a dual wielding system for pairing two weapons together of the same class. This requires having 50% higher stats than you would need to wield the weapons ordinarily, at which point you'll unlock the ability to power stance the weapon, which then turns your left bumper and trigger inputs into a dual wield attack. I find this to be a really innovative feature to the game, which allows players to play with a ton of different builds that can act pretty unique to one another. It is unfortunate though that you're not going to actually use any of those because the only reliable weapons are thrusting swords, which will most effectively be utilized by single wielding two-hand. Such as you can see I effectively utilized on this Stone Digger Troll minor dungeon fight. Really nothing else can even compare within this weapons sandbox because thrusting swords are comparatively much more effective at dealing damage efficiently while managing your stamina and having good reach. So many other weapons will fail pretty hard to hit any target efficiently and will blow your load of stamina in the process. And that's not to say that these weapons don't also come with their own pretty substantial weaknesses, especially within the functioning remotely well at all category. Most reliable weapon class, by the way. Anyway, we'll take what we can get, I guess. After this, we'll find the long-lost 3rd Knight's Cavalry, this time with a bird for a mount. And after he's done aura farming with his intro cinematic, we can begin this incredibly difficult boss fight. And now that we've beaten him, we can jack his ride and use it to take us to the next area. And within this area, we'll be able to find another unique aspect of this game, the fusion coil-like physics of barrels that are implemented in pretty much basically only this game, as far as I'm aware in Souls. However, being a physics mechanic within a game with limited physics does lend itself to having some pretty interesting interactions. Yeah, can be pretty awkward sometimes, but at least it's unique. What doesn't help matters is that there are set pieces in this game which require you to use this mechanic. So really you've just got to hope that it works right, otherwise it's going to cost you a trip back to the bonfire in order to actually unlock these areas. Moving on, we can eventually make our way to the triple Crystallian fight. This time with 3 of the same Crystallian, but so be it. The most interesting facet of this boss fight is the way that the terrain plays out, being that you're given this single platform to land on, which gives you some amount of strategy in order to deal with less than all 3 of the bosses at once. It is unfortunate that once you fall down, you're basically fucked and then have to fight all 3 of them, because there's no way back up to this platform afterwards. But you can pretty consistently deal with at least one of them, if not 1.5 or so, before it gets crowded and you've got to flee to the lower ground. A fall which deals damage to you, which is kind of a strange choice in the middle of a boss fight, but whatever. It's kind of similar to the fall that takes you into Gravelord Nito's arena, which deals damage that you'll have to heal while he potentially is attacking you at that moment. This fight was also the first moment where I ran into another one of the quirks of this game, which is the weapons are paper thin for whatever reason. At several points throughout a playthrough, you'll find yourself with your weapon close to breaking or entirely breaking while in the middle of a boss fight, which will require you to fumble through your inventories to find your repair powder if you have any. Otherwise, you can just consider yourself completely fucked. I was lucky this time to have some on me, which allowed me to finish this minor dungeon pretty easily, despite it being a somewhat difficult boss fight, as most triple enemy minor dungeon boss fights are. And just past here, you'll find that, oh, it's this friggin' guy again. You know how Souls always has a boss fight where it's just this friggin' guy over and over again? Well, this Knight's Cavalry is that. Except from this point forward, he'll always spawn as a regular world enemy instead of a boss. And he'll usually drop something pretty valuable, like Twinkling Titanite, or an upgraded version of the Ring of Blades. Now within this area, we'll also be able to use the Swordstone Keys, which will allow us to enter this next area, which contains what seems to be another minor dungeon boss fight with these god-awful gargoyles. This is one of those fights that high damage is absurdly useful, and low damage is extremely punishing, very reminiscent of the DS1 gargoyles, except this time on crack. Because if you can't deal with the gargoyles fast enough and safely enough, then you'll be dealing with up to 4 gargoyles at once, maybe more, I don't know, but either way it's an absurd amount to deal with at one time. It makes me really wish that I had a Sacred Relic Sword on me, but I guess I haven't gotten that far yet. Yeah, this fight is miserable, so I will be returning later once I've gotten considerably more powerful. So for now, we'll head on to the next fight, which is a boss fight where you can't see them very well and can't lock onto them and require a torch-based item in order to effectively fight them and counter those effects. Yep, the Black Knife Assassin, correct. A boss fight that becomes a pretty run-of-the-mill sword fight after you've subverted the gimmick. That being said, it's a pretty interesting fight for a minor dungeon. Now with that out of the way, I began exploring and eventually found myself to this location with a bunch of Stone Sword Key unlocks. The Stone Sword Keys are a really interesting thing in Elden Ring because they offer an item in the sandbox which can then allow you to unlock other items in areas as you explore, giving value to the items you've collected throughout your explorations. I think it's especially well done because most of these areas are entirely optional and just contain either some unique items or they offer shortcuts and sometimes offer entire minor dungeons that are locked away so you don't access them too early, such as in the case of the first minor dungeon in the game located in the Stranded Graveyard. I'm just glad that these Stone Sword Keys don't block off anything important, you know, like a boss weapon vendor who, after you unlock, fucks off right down the road until you find them again much later. Now within this area we'll also find, Romana, Saint of the Bud. Did not know I had made it to the DLC yet, but here we are. After unburying herself from the ground, she'll break a nearby tree, which is a small hint to you that you can break other trees in her arena, one of which will drop an item for you. This is pretty interesting, you know? You don't really see a lot of bosses that you have to kite around to get items, and I'm not too necessarily disappointed by that fact. It can be pretty obnoxious to try to get a boss to use a specific move in a specific area, and then also clutch up the rest of the fight while you're at it. But once you finally get her to break the tree, you can then collect the item and see what powerful weapon you've obtained for all your efforts. It's a flame butterfly. an item that allows you to ignite your torch on the go. Okay, well that sucks, but this boss also has another unique aspect, which is its tail is cuttable like in DS1. Doesn't drop anything, doesn't do anything at all actually. Maybe it reduces her hitboxes, but the hitboxes in this game are so bad it's hard to tell. What's especially strange is that there is a Scorpion Stinger Rapier in this game, which would have been perfect for a weapon drop here for cutting her tail, but whatever. I guess they didn't think of that. So, let's move on. The area immediately after this boss fight is another pretty large minor dungeon, which ends in a uniquely minor dungeon-esque boss fight. A single big enemy surrounded by smaller versions of itself, 4 of them to be exact. And the real kicker is that each of these 4 smaller enemies will deal toxic buildup, making them almost a death sentence unless you can find a way to deal with them. This fight is truly miserable. Thankfully, after you've beaten the ads, this boss goes down pretty easily. But it is hands down such a fucking obnoxious, frustrating garbage fight. And I'm so thankful that it's a optional minor dungeon fight. There really is nothing worse in a Souls game than a non-optional gank fight. Especially with like 12 dudes in it. So our next fight is the Prowling Magus in the Congregation. We're really pulling out all the stops as far as creativity goes. I absolutely can't wait to see these guys come back in Night Rain. The gameplay here is just too fun. Now on the flip side of that, our next fight is with a boss that actually seems pretty perfect for Night Rain, with an abundance of spooky, scary Halloween spiders to make up a bunch of ads in the fight, alongside a 2-headed giant spider. This boss seems like it would be perfect to co-op with. It almost seems as though it was inherently designed to be co-opted through, or at very least, fought alongside many of the NPC summons you can find throughout the game. In fact, I would say the gank-fest nature of the majority of the fights in this game kind of imply that's how you should play the game as a whole. I would bet that there's likely a strong correlation between people who are a fan of this game and people who played this game co-op. Whereas the opposite is true about people who do mainly solo or restrictive playthroughs and are more or less looking for intense one-on-one boss fights, who probably just don't like this game all that much, which is where I land. And I'd also be willing to bet that there's going to be a strong correlation between the fans of this game and the people who are going to be enjoying Night Rain the most. But that's just speculation. So the next fight we have is across this bridge here. It's an optional one inside of this Coliseum, guarded by this NPC invader who can pretty easily just dodge through and then get through the fog gate. Never mind. Because in this game, there are no iframes when going through a gate, which means we'll have to kill every single one of these ads here in order to stand a chance, which is easier said than done. As it appears within this area, the farther you go, the more ads you see, which builds to an absolutely fucking absurd degree. Well, now that I've collected about 25,000 ads to clear, I'll use this as a choke point here and try to pick them off one by one. Can't be that hard, can it? I've got the stone ring after. Okay, never mind. Those guys deal an insane amount of damage with their darkness-infused weapons. So instead, what I'll do is duck here into this corner, lure them away from the fog gate, and hopefully get through it before they have a chance to fucking fuck me. Okay, never mind. Never mind. Alright, you just gotta be quick. That's what you gotta do. You just gotta be speedy enough to get to the door, get through it. There's no way that they designed this so that I'll just lure him back, dodge that. Okay, here we go. We made some room, Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me? Oh, you know what? I didn't even want to fight that boss, and that fucking boss... That boss is for pussies, actually. It's a shitty boss. It's too easy. Doesn't drop enough souls. Doesn't give me enough of a challenge. It's for babies, for stupid babies, too. So, fuck that. We're done with that. Let's go on to something that's actually fun and well-designed, okay? Enough of this stupid kid shit. Let's go into a big boy fight. Okay, skeleton lords. 3 skeletons that go down like nothing. That's not exactly what I was looking for, but, you know, maybe there's a phase 2. They'll probably combine into one giant skeleton monster, right? That'll be sick. Okay, now there's bone wheels. Excellent. 3 skeleton lords and what looks like 2 bone wheels. That's something. Shitty, that's what it is. And now there's foot soldiers. Perfect. Didn't get enough of too many ads from 1 second ago. Let's just have another fight that's nothing but ads. Okay, well now we've got one last skeleton lord. Cleared everything else. Wasn't that much of a pain in the ass. You have got to be shitting me. How the fuck is this even considered a boss fight? Who designed this shit? Like, come on. This isn't a joke. They just took an entire catacombs worth of dudes, rounded them up and threw them at you, and pretended like that counts. I'll say again, I cannot wait to see these guys in Night Rain. And right before my weapon fully breaks, we finish. Awesome. So we can then proceed on to the next area, the Shaded Castle, which has been invaded by an even fatter version of Jabba the Hutt, who dies an even more pathetic death than being choked to death by a woman in a bikini. Actually, now that I say that out loud, that's kind of a chill way to go, shit. And after igniting a metal windmill on fire, we can then safely proceed into the boss fight with Transmesmer. You know, a spear-wielding snake person who fights with a combination of thrusts and dashes. There seems to have been some confusion, though, about which head he wanted cut off. Awkward. After this fight, you can proceed up an elevator positioned at the top of a windmill, which will obviously ascend into Volcano Manor, a legacy dungeon that contains the best drip in the game, and culminates in a fight with Phase 2 Fire Giant, whose arm attacks you'll bait out and then punish, in between flaming projectiles and AoEs. Honestly, not the worst fight in the world when he's not rolling around like an asshole and you have to chase him around. Not great, but I've seen worse. This is a little off topic, but one thing I wanted to talk about, now that we've finished the previous Legacy Dungeon, is Elden Ring's bonfire aesthetic system, which allows you to new game plus an area independently of the rest of the world. This does the standard things of increasing the enemy's defenses and attack, but it also respawns all of the items and the bosses of that area, while also adding all of the additions that may have changed in between a regular and new game run, such as certain items increasing in number or red phantoms being added to certain boss fights. This is a really cool item to add, and increases the value of any playthrough, allowing you to gather one item multiple times over, or one weapon multiple times over so you can dual wield them. I'm really glad this is in Elden Ring. It would be a real shame if a giant game didn't allow you an option to replay certain areas and certain boss fights easily. I also wanted to quickly address how a common criticism of the Elden Ring DLC is that a lot of bosses were missing out on cutscenes, and I find that to be kind of a minor complaint, you know, especially when you're not going to appreciate the cutscenes that we do get, and appreciate just how fucking badass they are. And with our new ladder installed, we can proceed into the Leyendell sewers and the minor dungeon underneath. This is a catacombs, and it ends in a gank boss fight with 100,000 rats, culminating in the defeat of their leader, a Mohawk rat. Honestly, there's a lot of minor dungeons in this game. It's kind of crazy. It's almost as if 90% of this whole game is the equivalent of the shittiest, most skippable aspects of a game that might come to be in the future. But the thing is, this game does actually have a pretty significant out if you wanted to excuse its lesser aspects of the early game. If you really wanted to be charitable towards this game, you could say that everything I've shown so far in this video is optional skippable content. Now, is this a realistic approach to criticism of this game? Not really, but at least it's there as an option. You see, the one barrier to the end game of this game and the final stretch of content in this game is a single door that can be unlocked after you've collected all of the Great Souls in the game. In a way, this is kind of mirroring the DS1 Ring 2 Bells mechanic in order to get access to Anor Londo, well, access to Sen's Fortress, and then Anor Londo. But this door can also be opened in another way, by collecting 1 million souls in soul memory. And for example, say there was an incredibly easy boss at the bottom of the hole of the Round Table Hold, well, you could use Bonfire Aesthetics to New Game Plus that boss and kill him multiple times over, and pretty easily get access to the million souls that you'll need to get through that endgame door. Now, do I consider this a good excuse for half of the game being kind of trash and worth skipping? Not really. The reality is that this isn't meant to be skippable content. It is part of the game, part of the main experience of the game, and a lot of it is gankfest nonsense. But I figured I'd mention it, if you want that as an excuse, go ahead and use it. I don't care. But now that we've opened that door, we have access to Drangley Castle, which introduces a unique aspect within this area in the form of these giant corpses, which can be filled with a soul in order for them to fulfill their purpose. This time being 2 of which that need to be filled in order to open the main door to the castle. And after making our way through this area, we can find Commander O'Neill and Niall. I didn't know they were tight like that. This fight is almost a direct carbon copy of the setup for the gargoyle fights in DS1. You start out with one major enemy turned boss, and halfway through the fight you introduce a reskinned copy of that boss with considerably less health. Luckily, it's a pretty easy fight, but again, makes for a pretty good minor dungeon fight. After this, we'll reach the point in the game where the end of the game is just out of reach, and we'll have to go through a long roundabout goose chase in order to be able to surmount that obstacle. By first going around and over the castle and meeting up with this fight with a minor dungeon fight of an electric crucible knight paired with a mimic tier he summons halfway through the fight. And just past him, we'll be able to descend into Safria River. One of the more controversial areas of the game being that most people either die to defend it or rightfully hate it. This area is filled to the brim with enemies that include mages with tracking projectiles, tankier melee enemies, hidden ambushing little bastards, all of which you'll have to deal with while not rolling off of the edge of the water's cliffside and instantly dying, something that's only really counterable by wielding a torch, which will go out if you dodge at any point while in the water. Now, I absolutely understand the criticism of this area, and I also get why people can easily defend it. You see, Elden Ring was the first Souls game that had a usable bow, at least usable beyond just glitches and clearing out naked hollows. The bow in this game deals significant damage and can widely be considered a part of your kit that you'll keep on you almost all the time, including in the DLC where it becomes part of puzzle mechanics. And if you take that into consideration, it's easy to point out that this area becomes a lot less oppressive when you can divide aggro and pick off weaker threats from range. I think this is best telegraphed to you by the corrosive giant bug that blocks your path, which you really can't deal with melee without shattering every item in your inventory. But it becomes trivial once you shoot him with a bow. That being said, I wouldn't exactly say that this area is well designed. Just because there's an answer doesn't mean that it's a great answer. The way I see it, this area is essentially designed in the exact same way that the original Anor Londo is. There's contrived placements of enemies that make them highly annoying to deal with and can pretty consistently result in your death from a simple roll. There's an abundance of ambush points, and ultimately your best way of dealing with the majority of these threats is to metagame them in one way or another through information you probably just looked up, because it's not all that intuitive. While I criticize both of these areas, I find at least this one to be a bit more straightforward in its design, and it fits the way the game was designed a bit more. That being said, both are shit. Anyway, at the end of this area, we meet a giant frog, which I don't remember being in Elden Ring. It's almost like they never designed a boss like this again, because a boss that's immune for more than half of its fight is really fucking boring. With that behind us, we can proceed into this minor dungeon catacombs, which contains another Commander O'Neill that we can pretty easily dodge through and find our way into this fight with Golden Godfrey. And after beating him, we can press on and see the state that Marika left Godfrey in after their terrible divorce, at which point we can loot the remainder of his shit, which includes the MacGuffin ring that allows us to painfully slowly equip and then open these king's doors, which then continue to open incredibly slowly. And after passing that threshold, we can enter this legacy dungeon, which contains this cheap ambush moment. Yeah, well, gotta wake up pretty early to surprise the old jester of boobs. You know, like, this is my first time, this is my first rodeo, you know what I'm saying? Does anyone actually like this game, or is it just like ironic? Anyway, past that, we get a fight with Agheel, except much slower and less cinematic, at which point we get to ascend into Farum Azula and get the chance to challenge these dragon knights in one-on-one combat. Or you'll have pissed off all of them early and can't get the chance to stop without fighting 1,000 dudes at once, and so you'll just sprint through all of them and end up with a giant line of gank following you into this conversation with the dragon, which will drop the time travel mechanic into your inventory. However, this is also a boss fight that you can trigger by attacking this enemy, but that's not necessarily going to despawn all of the adds that followed you into the arena. And so, for a subsequent re-challenge of this boss, you'll have to go through the gauntlet again, this time with a fog wall at the end, which can be incredibly difficult to get through with that many adds, all to fight a fight that's incredibly simple and deals shitloads of damage on hits. Yeah, I will be skipping this fight for now. And so, after obtaining the Rune of Death from Farum Azula, we can use it to go into these trolls' memories within these Everjails, where our goal will be ultimately to defeat their leader, this carrion troll. But first, I'm just going to stop and grab this item. Is there a single item in this game that you can grab safely without killing 30 guys and dodging some kind of absurd trap in the process? Whatever. After taking care of the carrion troll, you gain another nebulous item that will lead to your progression along the path towards this fight with a duo of enemies that can resurrect one another. One a tankier, slower boss, and one a skinnier, more agile boss. That's right, the Godskin duo. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually miss the fireballs they used to throw. This fight is a lot more boring with just melee attacks. And because this boss is the Godskin duo, it does not seem to have been designed with any sort of aggro reduction mechanic in order to make it fair, which is why challenge runners will use a bow within this fight, being that bows are actually quite valuable in Elden Ring. Now, with all of the important key items collected, we'll then be thrown into the final boss fight with Marika, an incredibly simple fight that's only really dangerous because of these fonts of darkness that she can spawn, which will deal damage over time, and as well as that will do a buildup of curse, which will continuously lower your health. Thankfully, you can break these fonts with a melee attack, and then proceed to do one of the most boring boss fights known to man. And after this fight, you'll be forced into the final cutscene, which sees you ascending the throne and becoming Elden Lord. However, at this point, you're forced into the unskippable credits, which includes the standard credits and the remastered credits. And let me tell you, I came really close to playing the entirety of these credits as a joke for the sake of this April Fool's Day video. Happy April Fool's Day, by the way. Where I would spend the entire time just ranting about, like, I don't know, Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid or something no one gives a shit about like that. But I figured that would make this video unwatchable, so we'll just skip the credits. Something I really wish you could do in-game. And so we'll move on and begin working our way through the DLCs, which were obviously very carefully integrated into the game at several points throughout, and require exploring and finding specific items to collect to allow you to enter them. It'd be a real shame if the Elden Ring DLC instead had just a giant lump of content at one point in the game, making it a lot less accessible. The first DLC takes us through Noxtella and shows off its Dragonkin soldier boss early on. And after we pass through a dragon temple, we'll eventually make our way to this area that's eerily close to the Lost Izalith vibes, with these weird half-dragon monsters. And eventually we'll find our way to a necromancer summoning boss who doesn't do much outside of that. She can summon 3 skeletons and Velstat, and you'll likely want high damage to deal with her quickly. And just past her, we'll find the Dragonkin of Noxtella, a reasonably difficult fight that will likely last long enough that you'll probably need to bring a repair powder with you. Actually, after rewatching my footage, he kinda looks a lot more like Dragonlord Placidusax, the way he pulls this backwards fire breath move. Either way, a pretty good fight. Maybe the first pretty good fight in the game. And then after this, there's no more fights in this DLC. Yep, nope, none. And if anyone says otherwise, well, they can go fight them themselves, because I don't want to fight 3 NPC dickheads in a cave. So let's move on to the next DLC, which first has us entering the Crucible of the Mountaintop of the Giants across this chain, really making me wish I had Torrent with me right about now. The main gimmick of this DLC involves the main bitch ex-wife of this DLC, who has split herself into these mini demonic idols, which you can destroy with a smelter wedge, an item you collect at 2 points, maybe more, throughout this DLC in order to rid yourself of their function, which buffs enemies around them and gives health regeneration. If you trek through the entire DLC, find all of the smelter wedges, and insert them into each of these idols, you'll obtain her soul, which can be traded in for her boss weapon, I believe. But you don't necessarily have to do that in order to fight the main bosses. The first of which is surrounded by 4 of these idols, which you'll need to get rid of if you don't want a persistent health regeneration and damage reduction on this boss. That boss being a boss that is widely considered to be the hardest in this game, is located at the bottom of an endgame legacy dungeon after a long drop down, and features a health regeneration effect. Yep, I'm talking about Millennia, obviously. Now this fight can be pretty difficult, but arguably one of the most difficult aspects about it is dealing with its terrible hitboxes, which pretty much anyone would recognize if they fought this guy more than once. But even despite that, it manages to reach that sweet spot where it's just hard enough and just satisfying enough of a fight that you'll probably still enjoy it anyway. It's one of the best fights in this game. Now, moving on, the next boss you'll fight is near the top of the tower and requires entering this armor to go through a small minor dungeon that is an absolute gauntlet of projectiles being thrown at you and ninja knights attacking you from all angles, but is pretty short, so it's not the worst encounter in the world. However, at the end of this, you'll find the final boss of this DLC, minus a reskin that I don't care about, which is with Sir Alon. Yeah, I don't have a gimmick for this one, it's not really in Elden Ring. Where you fight a buff version of the samurai starting class. Now this fight is really interesting, aside from just being a pretty good fight with a really satisfying moveset and only like a couple moves that are kind of bullshit. His grab move particularly has a pretty bad hitbox and you've got to predict for that. But really the most interesting thing about this fight is that it is the first and I believe only fight in Soul's history, unless I'm forgetting something obvious, that acknowledges whether or not you've no-hit the boss. And that's kind of crazy for this game of all games, one of the jankiest pieces of shit ever made, to have a boss fight that knows you can no-hit it. And it makes sense because it is one of the cleanest fights in the entire game, but it just doesn't make sense that this would be the game that has a no-hittable boss with a no-hit interaction. Absolutely mind-boggling. Anyway, this is overall an incredibly well-designed fight, and maybe that's just in comparison to the other fights in this game, but considering this DLC had 2 pretty solid fights, it's kind of quite the accomplishment. And right here in my footage, you'll be able to see the no-hit animation he plays where he commits seppuku, whereas in the original version, he just dies as normally and falls down. Kind of a cool attention to detail. Now moving on to the final DLC, we first have to go through an entire run of Castle Sol in order to obtain an item that will allow us to see the first boss. The first boss being an invisible tiger, you know, the Castle Sol tigers at the beginning of Castle Sol. What is interesting though is that this item also allows you to see any invisible items or enemies or ladders or such in the entire game, but that won't exactly be all that useful to you at this point in the game, being that we've basically reached the end of the end game. this is the final DLC. And this whole DLC is basically several instances of backtracking through the same areas with slight changes throughout. Your second run will begin after you've beaten the tiger and talked to the ex-wife of the king here, who will then unfreeze a bunch of set pieces throughout the world. And as you explore through your second go-through of this castle, you might stumble upon a gate that can be opened and reveals a coffin traversal method, which takes you to the consecrated snowfield. This area is utterly miserable, and that's mainly because of the periodic blizzards that will spawn ice deer to fuck you up as you go. There are several mechanics in place that are supposed to make this easier, such as the small towns inside that you can seek refuge in and will protect you from the deer spawning, but you're still gonna have to deal with up to 3 deer at once by the end, and it's utterly miserable to go through, all for the sake of a single duo fight of a reskinned copy and paste of the tiger. Yeah, I'll be skipping this, and instead I'll be returning to the collecting the knights phase of this DLC, which will take you all the way through a new area, including a minor dungeon that includes a copy paste of the covetous demon, which apparently was a seal, I guess. You collect the second or third knight, can't remember. And then I find my way to the final knight area, which is guarded by this NPC that is such a fucking troll. If you push this witch, she will back up and tell you aggro this larger ice knight, and then you have to fight both of them at once. Again, just one last dickhead moment from this game, hoping to catch you off guard one last time before you collect your final knight and can begin the final fight of the game, potentially. After collecting the final knight, you can join all your boys at this giant plunging hole which leads you to the old chaos. Now, as far as gank fights go, this is about as cool as they could possibly be. Making it a giant battlefield is an interesting choice that actually has some amount of creative vision, rather than just being difficult for the sake of difficulty and copy and pasting over and over for no reason. That being said, this fight is not all that interesting from a gameplay perspective. You kind of just hope that your ads are going to be doing any amount of work, because there's not a lot you can actually do to affect the fight. You do deal pretty good damage compared to your knights, but if you engage at all, you'll likely be aggroing multiple at once, and really it all just seems to come down to a crapshoot. Sometimes you'll be left over with a knight to help you into the final boss phase, and sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 of the enemy knights that are left over that you have to kill before you can start the final boss phase. And this final boss is pretty good. I don't know, I don't really have a joke or a comparison to Elden Ring at this point. I'm kind of tapped out. He kind of fights in a pretty similar way to Sir Alone, which isn't a bad thing, since he's a good fight and all, but this is about as good as a fight can get within this combat sandbox, where it does just enough interesting delays in moveset, and having just enough reward for skillful positioning and knowledge about the fight, but without the enhanced combat of the later Souls games, such as Sekiro, where you would have jumps, or Makiris, or whatever. Can't really do much. It's just good enough, and that's fine. Now, this was the final bit of footage that I needed, at least the final bit of larger footage outside of bits and bobs I would get later on. And so while I was at work the next day, I found myself thinking and reflecting upon my playthrough of this game so far, and how truly painful a lot of it was. More so than I'd ever even remembered. Specifically, the frigid outskirts felt basically impossible the way I was doing it, and for whatever reason, I could not seem to find any summon signs anywhere in the game. Not that I was searching much for them, because I don't really like playing with them all that much, but it did bother me that I couldn't seem to find them. And so while I was thinking back to the things that I had done in this playthrough, a tiny bit of cognitive dissonance wormed its way through. Wasn't there something I had seen which warned me my game would be getting more difficult? Something that I didn't see as important at the time. Something completely passive. I had forgotten that I had joined the fucking Covenant of Champions, or whatever it's called, at the very beginning of the game. I wanted to farm an item so that I could try out different builds and show off a bunch of different weapons potentially if I wanted to within this video. And to do so, you have to join this covenant, otherwise the enemies will despawn after you kill them a certain amount of times. And when you join this covenant, there is a small message that warns you that your game will be getting more difficult. And I completely forgot I had done this. This difficulty increase consists of a 50% increase to damage taken, and a 20% decrease to your amount of damage dealt. And on top top of that, it turns off all of your summons that you could potentially find in the world, meaning you're without help on a much more difficult version of the game, within a game that is constantly bombarding you with bullshit scenarios where health and damage are wildly important to have. Gank scenarios, frigid outskirts scenarios. This game is built to be crushed with damage and not to gimp yourself. Otherwise, you will be having a terrible fucking time. Who fucking said that Souls never had a difficulty setting? That is crazy. Now, there is one small benefit that you get for joining that specific covenant that I had been building towards throughout this entire playthrough without really recognizing it, and that is that every time you defeat an NPC invader, you get what's called an Awe Stone, the currency item that allows you to level up within that covenant. Now, this covenant requires 50 of that item to get its final reward, which is pretty insane. And while I hadn't obtained all 50, farming them becomes a whole lot easier when you've given yourself a 20 plus head start. And what, pray tell, is the item that you obtain when you reach all 50? Well, none other than my favorite weapon in the entire game, the Punch Ring. Shit. I am not doing that again. What a miserable piece of shit this game was.
That was the worst thing I ever heard.
It was terrible.
It was horrendous.
Well, it wasn't that bad.
Oh, yeah?
Oh, there were parts of it I liked.
Yeah, I liked a lot of it.
Yeah, it was good.
It was great.
It's wonderful.
Oh, bravo.
More.
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 More.